Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. The global financial markets are paying close attention to what direction the U.S. Federal Reserve will take under the leadership of its new chief, Janet Yellen. On today's After 10, an in-depth look at what to expect in the coming months and what the impact might be on the Korean and world economies. The U.S. Federal Reserve held a Federal Open Market Committee meeting this week. Global financial markets and the media are paying close attention to the direction the Fed will take under its new chair, Janet Yellen.
We use in this statement is considerable period. So this is the kind of term it's hard to define, but, probably means something on the order of around 6 months or that type of thing.
Yellen has taken the reins of the Fed, and the global financial markets have differing opinions on where U.S. monetary policy is headed. After 10 was joined by world-renowned economist Richard Cooper to assess the current challenges facing the world economy. Having a wide range of experiences in the field of politics and finance, he has taken a critical role in international economics. He was also Janet Yellen's professor when she was a college student. We are joined by Professor Richard Cooper today to discuss the expected impact of the U.S. Fed's monetary policy on the Korean and world economies. Professor Cooper, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the world is paying close attention to how Janet Yellen is going to be steering the monetary policy at the U.S. Fed. She's said she'd be willing to maintain some flexibility. What do you expect in terms of monetary policy in the coming months?
Well, first I want to say that we, especially journalists, love to personalize everything. And so I want to insist at the outset that Janet Yellen is chairwoman now, but she is chairwoman of a committee, and she only has one vote on the committee. There are 12 votes. And she has been a member of that committee for some years now. So I actually don't expect big changes in policy at all. She will become the chief spokesman for the committee, but I don't expect big changes in policy, except insofar as they're dictated by the economy, basically. As the economy improves, policy, of course, will change, but it won't be due to Janet Yellen. It'll be due to the change in the economy.
The U.S. Fed, as you mentioned, has a lot of responsibilities, maintaining price stability, growth, employment, overcoming crises. These are all part of the things that the U.S. Fed is looking at and trying to address, of course. What do you think the U.S. Fed in the coming months should be focusing on the most?
Well, the Fed has in the United States, in contrast with some other countries and in contrast with the Eurozone in Europe, the Fed has a dual mandate, which is to maintain price stability and high growth. And sometimes those two things are in serious tension, and so they have to decide how to balance them. But at the moment they are not in serious tension. Inflation rates are very, very low, and unemployment rates have dropped below 7%, but they're still high by American historical standards. So I expect that the Fed will maintain something like its current policy until the economy shows either some inflationary pressures, which we don't see so far, or until unemployment drops below. They put out a marker, 6.5%, and I think there's no doubt, unless there's a catastrophe of a type that no one foresees at the moment, that we will see some tightening of U.S. monetary policy in the coming months, perhaps not till the end of this year, early next year. It'll be dictated by economic events, and the Fed has very little inside information. Most of the information that the Fed has and looks at is known to everyone else. So we will be able to see, as the economy tightens, the growth improves, will be able to read exactly what the Fed reads, and at some point they will begin to tighten.
There are certainly challenges, though, out there. When you look at the current landscape, what are some of the biggest challenges facing the U.S. Fed, facing its new chairwoman, as you mentioned there, Janet Yellen?
Well, I think her challenge to her is to establish her credentials as a leading central banker, basically. She is the first female as head of the Fed. There have been females in other countries as heads of the central banks, but as far as I think I'm right in saying, no major country has. So she's a pioneer in that respect, and people will be watching her and how she handles herself. So far, I think she's done very well. But to remind, she is the chief spokesman of the Fed. She is not the chief decision maker of the Fed. It's a collective decision in which she's participated for the last several years.
Sure. The U.S. Fed continues to forge ahead with an ultra-easy monetary policy. Why is that?
As I said, given the dual mandate and no inflationary problems at the present time, and still high, it's down from its peak, but high unemployment and a weak recovery, most of their emphasis is on the employment side. I should have said, just to be clear, while they have the dual mandate, there is always a third mandate there, which is to deal with financial instability. And of course, that dominated the agenda back in 2008 and 2009. Since that time, since the recovery started, they've been focusing on recovery. But of course, financial stability usually requires an urgency of response, and I think they responded quite well back several years ago now.
There are some who are even going as far as to say that they may decide to put this into negative territory, to put the interest rate into negative territory. Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility. I don't see it as a likelihood. First, it has some technical complications, which it's doable, but it has some technical complications which they don't want to avoid. It would set some precedents which they would prefer to avoid. And if the economy doesn't call for it, I don't think they'll do it. I think the issue before us is the timing of monetary tightening. It's sure to come. The question is whether it comes in the second quarter of this year, the fourth quarter of this year, or the early first half of next year, and that will depend on overall economic developments.
Developing nations have really been taking a beating because of the stimulus tapering. Even the discussion about the tapering has had an effect. How serious do you view that situation as it affects these developing nations?
Well, I find myself in a curious position with respect to all of the palaver, I would call it, coming from officials and from financial journalists on the impact of tapering on developing countries. First, I think tapering is an odd word. I would say it's U.S. monetary policy, and it's tightening of U.S. monetary policy, and the mechanisms vary. It surely will tighten sometime in the next 2 years. That's been known for a long time. But it will only tighten in the context of a stronger U.S. economy. Those two things go together. If the economy remains weak, monetary policy will remain easier. If I had to choose, and I were in Brazil or Turkey or the various other countries that have complained, Korea, I'm not aware that Korea has complained, but the sentiment is here. I would choose a strong U.S. economy and tighter monetary policy to a weak U.S. economy with easy monetary policy. And therefore, I don't understand the complaints that have been made about, quote, tapering, really tighter U.S. monetary policy, because I think they assume that the tapering takes place in a vacuum. And it doesn't take place in a vacuum. It takes place in the context of what's happening to the U.S. economy. So I find myself out of sorts with these complaints. I think they're misconceived, basically.
Janet Yellen did tell the G20 finance ministers recently that she fully understands the concerns coming out of the developing world about U.S. monetary policy. You mentioned you take more of a long-term perspective on all of this, but in terms of monetary policy, is there something that the U.S. Fed can do to perhaps give some comfort and maybe some stability to the developing nations that are seeing some turmoil right now?
I think it can't do more than it has done in providing stability. We've had low federal funds rates now for a long time, many years. If you would ask in early 2010, would we, by early 2014, that's 4 years ago, still be having interest rates this low? I dare say the overwhelming consensus would be no. But there's been a lot of stability now, and the actions in terms of open market operations, the Fed has been buying securities at the rate of $85 billion a month. It's dropped down to $75 billion. I hardly call that as a radical, dramatic shock to the world economy. So again, I'm slightly uncomprehending about the comments that are coming. Developing countries are reacting to, the official spokesmen and journalists are reacting to developments in financial markets. Development in financial markets have not been stable, and that's not just a phenomenon of the last 2 months, that's a phenomenon of the last 50 years, and it will be a phenomenon of the next 50 years. And I think we all have to get used to, I would call them the irrationalities of financial markets. And I think developing countries in framing their policy, including the openness of their capital markets, have to allow for the fact that there are going to be some, in some cases incomprehensible, in other cases perfectly comprehensible but entirely unhelpful reactions in financial markets. And I think countries need, including, by the way, the United States, needs to take that into account in framing policy. But I don't, there's nothing that I can think of that the Fed could or should be doing to create a more stable environment than they have done.
Foreign media outlets have shown positive opinions on the Korean economy, saying that Korea will be a big beneficiary when the U.S. economy recovers. However, on March 13th, the Korean economic journal Chosun Biz released an article titled "The Two Faces of the Korean Economy." According to the article, the amount of Korea's government bonds in foreign central banks have increased 4 times over the last 5 years. It shows that Korea's state assets are considered to be risk-free. But at the same time, Korea's stock market usually slips when unstable financial conditions arise in developing nations. What more is needed for the Korean economy to cope with the ups and downs of the global financial markets?
When you look at the way Korea's responded to the tapering and all the recent events we've seen over the past few months, how do you assess what you've seen?
Well, usually Korea is, in my observation over the years, is overly anxious about everything, but usually responds quite well. They're excessively anxious. There's a lot of worry in this country. I've never been visited here where there hasn't been something that's been worrying Koreans. But Koreans are quite adept responders, particularly compared with other countries. So I'm not very worried about Korea.
I think a lot of people aren't worried either. The foreign press continues to point to the Korean economy as being one of the economies to look at. The Wall Street Journal's specifically pointed it out as one of the top markets to look at moving forward. When you look at the Korean economy based on what everybody else is looking at, why the optimism when we look forward?
I think it's based on good performance since the mid-'60s. I mean, Korea undertook its major liberalization and growth-oriented policies, both exchange rate policy, protectionist policies, and macroeconomic policies in the mid-1960s. Under pressure, I want to add, from the U.S. aid agency, which encouraged them to do that. And Mr. Park was president at that time, Park Chung-hee. And Korea moved in that direction. It showed some initially positive results. And so Korea went further and further. Korea made some mistakes. I think some parts of the heavy and chemical industry policy of the early 1970s were mistaken. So Korea is not different from other countries in not making mistakes. Where it differs is that when it recognizes the mistakes, it corrects them more quickly. Too many governments, when they make mistakes, they hang in there. They want to, for whatever reason, you can imagine a variety of reasons that governments are reluctant to acknowledge and react to their mistakes. And I think Korea has done a good job, better job than most countries do. And Korea has done an outstanding job of moving up the quality scale in terms of the nature of the products it produces and the quality of the products that it produces. It's like many poor countries, started with textiles and tennis shoes. Textiles really means apparel, not textiles, apparel and tennis shoes, and has gradually moved up the technology scale. And so I think the optimism around the world about South Korea has, rests on outstanding performance.
We've had people write in and ask you a couple questions. These questions come via Twitter, and the first one being, Japan is promoting Abenomics as a means of stimulating the economy. How effective has it been, and how effective will it be in the future?
Well, I think if one talks about 2013, it has been quite effective in the sense that Japan last year came out of its long period of languor, economic languor. It got a big stimulus of monetary policy. It got a big stimulus of fiscal policy, and both of those boosted up the economy. And they apparently did something to consumer confidence also, because the stock market performed positively. This is not a prescription for long-term growth. This is a prescription for short-term buoyancy, which should make it easier to make structural changes, which would contribute to long-term growth. And my own view as an outsider is I've been disappointed in the policies the structural policies that have actually been undertaken. Prime Minister Abe gave very strong, I would say, promises, but also very general promises last May, last June, about what he called the third arrow, the first being monetary policy, the second being fiscal policy. The third arrow would be the structural policies, and as far as I can tell, he's having a hard time getting the arrow out of the quiver. The complications of Japanese politics are more formidable than he expected, even within his own party. And Japan has a demographic profile that's similar to Korea's, and I think the Japanese have to lower their expectations about long-term growth. But we know that there are some structural changes in Japan which, if handled well, could raise Japanese GDP per capita. But the Japanese seem to have a hard time making those structural changes.
Professor, one more question from Twitter we have here. You've been pessimistic about the opinion that the Chinese economy can achieve both innovation and growth at the same time. What is your specific outlook for the Chinese economy in the near future?
I think that for a variety of reasons, the growth of the Chinese economy will inevitably slow down. Some of them are demographic. China is aging very rapidly and has a declining number of young people. There's been very extensive migration out of agriculture. There's still a lot of people in agriculture, but they're getting older. And so the most mobile people have already moved. So I think that movement will continue, but at a slower. And finally, China has experienced over the last 30 years double-digit export growth. It's now the world's largest exporting country. That can't go on. To a first approximation, China's exports can't grow more than the world economy. So that's 6% in nominal terms. I mean, so there's a little bit of inflation in there. In terms of real innovation, I'm still waiting to see it from China. There are a few examples, but I don't think of China as an innovative a creative economy. And the view that I'm forming, which doesn't mean it's correct because I'm not really a specialist on China, is that the educational system is too rote. And so I do not expect China to become a really innovative country, as distinguished from an entrepreneurial country, for another generation.
We get you out of here on this. As Janet Yellen navigates through all of the challenges that will be coming up in the coming weeks and coming months, if you could give us your general outlook of what we can expect, maybe from the U.S. Fed, maybe from the U.S. economy as a whole in the coming months and years. I know you're not predicting or able to predict anything, but what do you expect to see?
Well, I'm not a forecaster by profession or by inclination, but I try to pay attention to the forecasts, and I think the outlook for the next, if you're talking about a time horizon of say 18 to 36 months, the next 2 or 3 years, I think the outlook for the U.S. economy is one of continued, actually somewhat accelerating growth. Last year was not a strong year, it was positive, but under 2%. I would expect this year will be over 2%, perhaps even close to 3% later in the year, and maybe over 3% next year. We have that capacity, and the question is whether it's realized. So that's good for America, and it's good for the rest of the world. Europe is in a very weak recovery, and there are a number of serious problems the Europeans haven't solved yet, but I don't see them going into negative territory either. And so China's growth, for I think structural reasons, is not going to be in double digits again, but it'll still be high by global standards. I'm moving from 10 to 7 or 6% feels bad if you're living in that environment, but from an international perspective, it still looks pretty good. 7% looks pretty good. So I expect the world economy, taken as a whole, to get gradually better, not as rapidly as I would like, but nonetheless get gradually better in the coming year, 1 to 3 years. Yeah.
Professor Cooper, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.
We will continue to do our best to improve our show based on the perspective of our viewers. Always feel free to leave us any comments, great ideas, or suggestions you wish to share with us.